Young policewoman challenges black judge's authority. What happens next surprises everyone. The city court that morning was plunged into an almost supernatural tranquility, an icy tranquility that seemed barely interrupted by the discreet whispering of employees and the rustling of papers. This precarious atmosphere, however, heralded an extraordinary day. Every corner of the room, every bench in the audience, every corner of the room seemed to be preparing for the inevitable outburst that was to follow. The ceiling, high and imposing, and the large windows which let in the pale morning light, painted an almost unreal scene, where time seemed suspended, as if to better reflect the gravity of the moment to come. Judge André Moreau was already seated behind his dark wooden desk, the very example of serenity and rigor. The morning light, filtering through the windows, touched his marked features, adding an aura of gravity to his face. At 45, he had become an essential figure in the country's legal landscape, an icon of justice, respected by his peers and feared by those who sought to manipulate the system in favor of their own interests. His rise had not been easy. He had had to fight against obstacles that went far beyond the simple challenges of a professional career. His journey had been marked by an inflexible determination to eradicate the racial injustices that plagued society and the justice system. Injustices that he had experienced, directly or indirectly, throughout his life. He had grown up in a neighborhood where black men and women were too often easy targets for police brutality, where the authorities' mistakes outnumbered the opportunities to deliver justice. But Moreau, far from giving in to anger or resentment, had made this struggle a pillar of his commitment. Every step of his journey had been a challenge against injustice. His piercing gaze, like a sharp blade, left no room for hesitation, and he never let himself be carried away by emotions. He had learned to control his feelings, to observe the facts objectively, to judge with discernment, because he knew better than anyone that his role was not limited to applying the law, but to embodying justice itself in a world where the latter often seemed absent. Today, this weight, that of justice, would be felt more than ever. The case that was going to be judged was not trivial. It was a trial that went to the very heart of the social and racial tensions that were tearing the country apart. Lieutenant Thomas Lemaitre, a respected police officer formerly decorated for his courage and his service, was accused of brutality towards Antoine, a young black man, victim of an abuse of power during an arrest. Young Antoine had done nothing more than a minor infraction, but the police intervention quickly became disproportionate. Videos of the scene, captured by witnesses, showed the unnecessary violence of the police officer, his incredible aggressiveness as he controlled the young man in a way that in no way corresponded to the offense committed. The medical reports of the injuries Antoine suffered were damning, and the testimony of eyewitnesses accelerated the demonstration of injustice. Yet, despite the overwhelming force of the evidence, Lemaitre continued to proclaim his innocence. He maintained that he had acted out of fear, that he believed his life was in danger, and that he had acted in self-defense. He had asked that the circumstances and stress he was under be taken into account. His defense, although imperfect, was based on the idea that a police officer must be able to react quickly and forcefully to what he perceives as a threat. For him, the brutality was not intentional, but a human reaction to a tense situation. Judge Moreau knew that today, he would not render a simple judicial decision. It was not a case like any other. This case was not just a conflict between a police officer and a young man. She represented a reflection of society. He would have to judge not only a man, but also the system that had trained and nurtured him. He knew that that day, his decision would not only be a judgment on the guilt or innocence of Lemaitre, but a declaration on the place that justice should give to the suffering experienced by black communities in the face of police brutality. How he decides this case could resonate far beyond the walls of the court, sending a message to an entire nation. The courtroom was crowded. The families of young Antoine, who hoped to obtain justice for their son, were there, silent but full of hope. The prosecutor, a man in his 50s with a stern look, had made it a matter of principle, a fight for civil rights and against the systematic abuse of power to which too many young black men were victims in the streets of the city. Journalists, lawyers, civil rights activists, all were present, each awaiting the verdict as if it were a litmus test for the future of social justice in the country. The trial took place as planned, with a fluidity which reflected the habit of legal proceedings. but also a palpable tension which had built up as the testimonies accumulated. Each new voice seemed to add another layer to the complexity of the case, reinforcing the weight of the facts and accusations. The witnesses, called to the stand, gave a damning insight into the abuse of power. Surveillance videos, captured in neighborhoods often ignored by authorities, showed disproportionate violence. These images, projected on the walls of the court, had taken on an almost symbolic dimension, like a mirror held up to society, reflecting not only the character of the police officer involved, but also that of the system he represented. The room vibrated with tension, like a taut wire ready to give way under the weight of what it symbolized. Young Antoine's families, civil rights activists, journalists and lawyers were all present, seated, some hanging on every word spoken, others in expectant silence, anticipating the outcome of what seemed much more than a simple trial. It was a reflection of a larger battle, a clash of principles and values against a backdrop of collective suffering. When the Attorney General took the floor to summarize the facts, his tone, initially measured, gradually transformed into a passionate appeal for justice. It was no longer just about a man or an offense, but about a system. He pressed heavily on the theme of systemic violence, a phenomenon that extended well beyond this court and affected many black communities in the city, but also nationally. He recalled damning statistical studies, reports of internal investigations often suppressed by political pressure, and harrowing anecdotes of anonymous victims who, day after day, faced police brutality without ever obtaining redress. The emotion in his voice was palpable. With every word, he expressed the indignation of an entire people, a people too often ignored and marginalized. He spoke of the invisible scars left by years of unpunished police violence, of shattered lives, of children growing up in constant fear. He wasn't just trying to convince the court, he sought to touch the soul of every person in the room. His speech resonated like a silent battle cry, a call for responsibility, fairness, and awareness of a deeply rooted evil in society. Then it was the defense lawyer's turn. Leah Dupuis, a young police officer in her 30s, stood up to speak. The room, so tense a few moments earlier, greeted his entrance with a murmur of curiosity. At first glance, she seemed far too young to find herself in such a decisive role in such a serious matter. But his eyes, piercing and determined, betrayed the firmness of his commitment. She was not just a defense lawyer. She was a police officer, and this detail was far from trivial. Leah Dupuis was not only there to defend her colleague, Lieutenant Lemaitre, she was there to defend the image and honor of an entire profession. She stood before a skeptical audience, a room divided between the expectations of justice served for young Antoine and the reality of a police institution often called into question. She spoke confidently, her sharp words echoing in the silence of the room. "Your Honor, Lieutenant Lemaitre is not a criminal," she said, staring at the judge with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. She sought to demonstrate that Lemaitre's use of force was an instinctive reaction to a stressful environment, not a premeditated act. "He did not act out of malice," she continued, "but out of fear. It was not an excess of power, it was a human reflex." His tone was implacable, but it also carried something more, a deep conviction that his client, like so many other police officers, was caught in a system where fear and urgency too often dictated actions. Leah insisted on the impeccable character of Lieutenant Lemaitre, highlighting his years of service, his medals, and his commitment to his community. "He did his duty," she said, "and he does not have to be judged for circumstances he did not choose." She tried to show that what had happened that day was only an error of judgment, a moment of confusion under pressure, a human error rather than an act of malice. When the prosecutor and the defense lawyer had finished their closing arguments, a heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes were on Judge Moreau, who slowly stood up, his expression impenetrable. The weight of the decision was immense. There was complete silence as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. But just as he was preparing to speak, something unexpected happened. Leah Dupuis stood up abruptly. Without warning, she cut the silence with her firm voice, a challenge both bold and desperate. "Your Honor, I cannot accept this verdict," she cried, her voice trembling slightly under the pressure, but her words carried the force of an unstoppable torrent. "You cannot judge a man by the color of his skin, nor can you base a decision on crowd and media pressure. The room instantly froze. The murmurs stopped, the breath stopped, as if time itself had stopped passing. Leah continued, her hard and defiant gaze fixed on Judge Moreau, as if she were ready to face the authority itself. What we have here is not a case of abuse of power, but a simple error of judgment driven by emotion. I ask you to reassess your evidence, to take into account the circumstances. This is not justice. This is not what is expected of you. His words were filled with passion, but also certainty. She was willing to risk everything for her conviction. Judge Moreau, who had been a figure of undisputed authority, remained frozen, his eyes fixed on this young policewoman who had just challenged his authority with an audacity that he would never have imagined. The pressure in the room was palpable. Leah Dupuis, a young white woman, dared to question a respected black judge, who had built his career in part on his fight against racial injustice. The situation was bitingly ironic. The challenge was all the more striking because it came from a policewoman, a woman, and not from a man of more imposing stature. But this irony was not merely symbolic. It touched on much deeper roots of society, justice, and equity. An essential question arose. Would a young white police officer overthrow the authority of a respected black judge? The room held its breath. The silence in the room was almost palpably dense, as if each person was holding their breath, waiting for Judge Moreau's reaction. The latter, initially stunned by the boldness of Leah Dupuis' intervention, seemed frozen in time, his piercing eyes never leaving the young lawyer who, standing up, dared to challenge his authority. This unexpected confrontation would redefine the dynamics of the courtroom, which until then had been dominated by a game of advocacy and counterpleading. But now the real clash seemed to take place between Leah's youth, her idealism, and Moreau's imposing wisdom. The judge took a deep breath, his piercing gaze shining with measured intensity. The weight of the responsibilities that rested on his shoulders was felt more strongly in this suspended moment. When he spoke, his voice, calm but firm, left no room for doubt. "Mademoiselle Dupuis," he began, his clear, sharp words echoing through the room. "Please sit down again. The court is not a place for provocations. We are here for the truth, not to play politics." He articulated each syllable with a natural authority, a mastery that came from his many years of experience. Yet, beneath this impassive mask, a flash of surprise flashed in his eyes. He had already seen passionate lawyers and moving pleadings, but this intervention, coming from a young policewoman, was unprecedented. However, Leah Dupuis, far from submitting to the pressure of her superior, remained standing. His body was tense, his heart beating hard in his chest. She knew full well that this position could cost her dearly. She knew that defying a judge, especially one of Moreau's stature, could result in dramatic professional consequences, even disciplinary sanctions. But there was something in his soul that prevented him from remaining silent. It was a mixture of idealism and despair, a deep-seated belief that she must take advantage of this rare opportunity to make a difference. This trial was not just a legal matter. It was a struggle against a deeply entrenched system of power. An opportunity to break down the invisible walls that separated communities, to break the chains of racism and police violence that affected working-class neighborhoods, to the detriment of justice. She felt that if this trial did not represent a turning point, then nothing could really change. Judge Moreau, visibly annoyed and eager to regain control of the situation, made a circular gesture with his hand, as if to signal the defense lawyer to prepare to conclude. It was clear that he wanted to restore order and finish this session without further interruptions. But, in a moment of surprising calm, he seemed to pull himself together. He was not a man to give in to irritation, but he allowed himself one last thought, a warning. "All right. You have chosen to defy the order of the court," he said in a calm but meaningful voice. "But know this, Miss Dupuis. Law is not built on arrogance." These words, far from being a simple admonition, were also a brutal reminder of the hierarchy and the rules which govern this legal world. Even more, it seemed to tell him that his act of defiance was just a waste of time in a setting where personal opinions had no place. "If you are so convinced of the truth of your case, then prove it outside of this room," he added in an almost paternalistic tone, but without an ounce of contempt. This trial is only about justice, not your personal opinions. The tension in the room rose a notch at these words. If Judge Moreau had in fact chosen not to expel Leah Dupuis from the room, he left no doubt that he saw her intervention as an inappropriate gesture, even harmful to the integrity of the judicial process. The room was plunged into suspended anticipation, everyone weighing the strength and fragility of what had just happened. Leah, despite the firmness of the reprimand, felt that the judge's words were less a condemnation than an invitation to leave the strictly legal framework and bring her cause into the public arena. But this invitation came at a high price. The final verdict finally came, a sentence that seemed inevitable given the accumulated evidence. Lieutenant Lemaitre was found guilty of abuse of power. Murmurs crossed the room, some smiles appeared among those who had supported Antoine's family, while others seemed disappointed by a decision that they considered insufficient. Although this verdict was morally satisfying for the victim and those campaigning for justice, it offered no solution to the underlying problems. It was only a drop in the ocean of necessary reforms. This judgment, as important as it was on a symbolic level, was only a step, a small victory in a much larger fight. Leah Dupuis, as she took her place again, felt the weight of failure on her shoulders. But at the same time, she felt a form of respect for Judge Moreau, who, despite the tension and discomfort of the situation, had managed to maintain a certain form of dignity and calm. She now understood that the law, in its purity, could not be reduced to a simple battle of opinions or personal intentions. More was needed. It took time, patience, and above all, a fierce desire to challenge the structures that perpetuate injustice. This verdict was not the end of the process. It was just a first step in a long path of reforms and real changes. But in a way, Leah knew that, even if her method had been clumsy, her cause was more legitimate than ever. The next day, Leah Dupuis showed up in Judge Moreau's office with palpable nervousness. The events of the day before, her daring intervention in the courtroom, kept running through her mind, and she knew she had to face the consequences. Every step she took towards the judge's office seemed to resonate like an echo in her mind, amplifying her doubts. However, she did not hesitate to push the door. The judge, seated behind his imposing dark wooden desk, observed him with a penetrating but non-judgmental gaze. His eyes were like oceans of experience and calm, capable of detecting the slightest worry while masking a depth of thought. "Mademoiselle Dupuis," he finally began, in a quiet but firm tone. He gestured for her to sit down, not breaking the silence, his gaze fixed on her as if analyzing each of her movements. He was waiting, not for Leah to justify herself, but for her to understand what had just been said, and what was going to follow. The silence settled between them, heavy with meaning. Leah sat, folding her hands on her knees, waiting. The judge was in no hurry to speak. He preferred to let the tension develop so that it pushed the young lawyer to reflect on her actions. Then, after a long pause, he broke the silence with measured words. "You are young, Mademoiselle Dupuis, and I recognize the passion that drives you. But what you lack is the humility to listen and learn." His words hit Leah harder than she expected. It was not irony, nor condemnation, but an observation of wisdom acquired over the years. You challenge the system, but do you really know how to change it? You are in a position of power, and it is not enough to criticize. You must commit to improving this system, to working for justice in a more effective way. He paused, his eyes staring at Leah with an intensity that seemed to probe his soul. These words were both a criticism and an invitation. There was no hostility in his voice, only a call for reflection. Leah felt destabilized, but also deeply touched. She understood that the judge was not trying to demean her, but to make her understand a deeper truth. He was not asking him to give up his passion or his ideals, but to direct them in a more constructive direction. It was not enough to denounce injustices or want to fight them with powerful words. For real change to occur, it was also necessary to know how to work within the workings of the system, to find flaws there, and to exploit them with intelligence and perseverance. She realized that she was not yet ready to fight this battle in a more strategic, more thoughtful way. The judge, seeing that she was meditating on his words, continued with almost paternal calm. I see you, Mademoiselle Dupuis. You have potential, a strength of character that is not found in everyone who enters this profession. But you must channel this potential. You must learn to work with those you want to change, not just against them. Leah could only look at Judge Moreau, head tilted slightly, absorbing every word he said. She had thought that her actions, her desire to rebel, were the only way to create change. But at that moment, she understood that revolt, as noble as it may be, must be accompanied by the ability to dialogue, to reflect, to engage in in-depth work. To create lasting change, you had to be pragmatic, while remaining true to your beliefs. Suddenly, after this moment of silent reflection, the judge broke the silence and extended a hand, a rare opportunity in this often rigid and tradition-bound world. I will offer you a place on my commission for the review of police practices. If you truly believe in change, this is where you will need to act. The words resonated in Leah like a breath of fresh air after a long moment of suffocation. It was an opportunity, an open door to a more constructive way of fighting for justice. She felt that she had just received a mission, a responsibility that she could not ignore. She looked into the judge's eyes, her nervousness fading away, replaced by a renewed sense of determination. She knew this was not a simple compromise, but a real challenge. The opportunity to join a working group on police reforms would allow him to change things from the inside. She stood up, her posture now more assured, and replied without hesitation. I accept, Mr. Judge. I will do everything in my power to be part of this change. This meeting, which began as a confrontation, ended on a note of collaboration. What Leah had seen as a confrontation with the system, a quest to shake up the established order, had transformed into a partnership, a path of reconciliation and learning. She now understood that real change would not come just from power grabs or symbolic gestures, but from the willingness to work with those in power and slowly but surely push for real, more inclusive and equitable justice. Thus, the story of Leah Dupuis and Judge André Moreau marked a turning point in the fight for true justice. What began as a bold challenge, a questioning of authority, had transformed into an unexpected but necessary collaboration. Together, they would confront systemic injustices, armed not only with Leah's passion but also with Moreau's wisdom. They both knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, but it was a journey that they would now be ready to travel together.